And now today's featured speakers are Bentley University professor Jeff Gulati and Dan Merica, class of 2010. Jeff Gulati is a professor of political science in the Global Studies Department at Bentley University. He earned his PhD in government from the University of Virginia and Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from UNC Chapel Hill. His primary research interests are in political campaigns, digital campaigning strategies, the U.S. Congress, and congressional elections. Professor Gulati is a member of the Executive Council of Pi Sigma Alpha, the National Political Science Honors Society, a member of the senior editorial boards of the Journal of Information Technology and Politics, and the Journal of Political Marketing. We're looking forward to his return from sabbatical this fall. Dan is a CNN political reporter based in Washington, D.C., covering the Democratic presidential primary and 2020 election. He joined CNN in 2011 and has covered President Trump's first year in office, the 2018 midterm elections, Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, and more. Dan is a proud Nevadan and graduated from Bentley with a degree in global studies. He was supposed to be here this weekend attending his reunion, followed by a master's degree in journalism and public affairs from American University. Without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Professor Jeff Gulati and CNN reporter Dan Merica.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. So I'll begin with the first question. I have a question for Dan. Those of us who study campaigns and elections and follow campaigns and elections, one of the most exciting times is the presidential campaign and seeing the candidates go out on the road and hold their campaign rallies. And so my first question to you is, how has that changed? How less are they on the road? And when they are on the road and they're interacting with the public, how has that changed? What are you seeing different in the way that candidates conduct themselves? And then let me ask a follow-up question right away, is how does that change the way that you do your job in covering the candidates?
I mean, it's night and day. It's completely different. In 2016, I was the embedded reporter on Hillary Clinton's campaign, and I spent over 300 days on the road. So it's very, I got rid of my apartment in DC as a anecdote. So I really didn't have a home for that year. I traveled the entire year, going to campaign events and the like. And that's just not happening this time around. No political events have really taken place since mid-March, really since early mid-March, once the coronavirus became a real issue. And that was really around the time that Joe Biden was kind of consolidating and winning the primary. I mean, there was a debate that happened during the start of the coronavirus between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. But after that, Biden became really the presumptive nominee, and especially when Bernie Sanders dropped out, I believe in early April, that was. But it's completely different. I mean, you're losing the texture of campaign reporting, I think, that you would have if reporters were out there talking to people. It's really difficult. I think a lot of reporters, including myself, have found to find voters to talk to when you're coming in from your kitchen in Washington, D.C., and not out on the trail and talking to people in Ohio and Florida and North Carolina and all these swing states. As for the campaigns, it's totally remade campaigning. The campaign is pretty much happening entirely on digital right now. I mean, Joe Biden has been doing live events somewhat daily from his basement, from his living room, sometimes from his backyard. He had his first in-person interview actually with CNN a couple days ago. So you're seeing kind of a return to some normalcy, but I think it remains to be seen how these campaigns are going to hit the road again. I wonder, are you going to see these traditional rope lines where a candidate gives a big speech and then spends an hour shaking hands along a rope line that really were hallmarks of the 2016 campaign and campaigns long before that? Donald Trump has traveled a bit more. He has access to the Abbott rapid test that he gets at the White House. So he is able to travel, and the reporters that cover him go with him on Air Force One. They are also tested for coronavirus, as well as some of the aides that are on the plane. So he has traveled. Some of that travel has been to swing states. A lot of it, in fact, has been to swing states. But those are all for White House official events. Obviously, politics is ingrained in those events, but it has totally remade the 2020 election, and I think it's unknown when it's going to, or if it's going to get back to normal.
Do you have any insights on how the conventions are going to be held? Will there be any live events with actual people attending?
I mean, you think about what a convention is. It's basically like a rock concert featuring a speaker who is a Barack Obama, a Joe Biden, a Donald Trump, whoever. Maybe a rock concert is too generous to those candidates, but it's the same feel. You're in a big arena. There's thousands of people there crammed in together. I mean, they're literally cramming in as many people as possible. That's just something we're not seeing during the coronavirus, and I think it's hard to see how that happens. Planners right now it's like they're planning on different universes. The Democrats are being very cautious. They moved back their convention from mid-July to mid-August, so about a month. Their convention is supposed to be in Milwaukee, but they're very open about the fact that there might be a need for a digital convention or some sort of scaled back convention. Maybe 20% of the delegates go, and the rest happens online. There are a number of hoops and rules that the Democratic National Committee has to pass in order to make that possible. Right now, virtual voting isn't possible because really a convention is electing a candidate, is nominating a candidate. Obviously, there's the fundraising aspect to it. There's the media aspect to it. It's a big show. And that, I think a lot of Democrats and Republicans are grappling with how to do both, to both nominate a president and still get that media bounce. The Republicans, though, are steadfast, saying that they are dead set. They're going to have a traditional convention. You saw this week, President Trump almost threatened the North Carolina governor, who is a Democrat, who is up for re-election in 2020, saying that he wants certainty that he is able to have his convention in Charlotte in a traditional format. Now, some Republicans behind the scenes will acknowledge and have acknowledged to planners in North Carolina that there may need to be scaled back protocols, but it really is tough to see how Trump will agree to that when he is so dead set on having a big convention. And in response to North Carolina kind of equivocating, saying we can't guarantee that you're going to have 50,000 people in Charlotte, you've seen other states run by Republicans, Florida, Georgia, and Texas, step up and say, we'd happily put on the convention. So it is becoming very much a partisan political issue of whether a convention can go on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
One last question. I want to follow up on something you said. You said you were on the road the last campaign, 300 days.
Yeah.
Out of three. I mean, that's a lot. And it's quite cool.
That's where I got these bags under my eyes. They're still not going away.
It's grueling, but I assume that's also exciting. That's why you do it, and why others, do it campaign after campaign.
Yeah.
So, do you miss that? Are you really ready to get back on the road?
Yeah, it's exciting, and you got a lot of that at the start. I mean, I was on the road for 10 weeks out of I think 11 or something like that at the start of this year. You had the Iowa caucus, New Hampshire primary, South Carolina, Nevada, and then Super Tuesday happened, and that's really when campaigning stopped. Is when Super Tuesday, which was in early March. So yeah, I miss it. I mean, it's been nice to, my wife and I got married last year. She's also a reporter. We kind of were planning on getting married and then this year not seeing each other much because she covers the Trump campaign. So we were planning to somewhat operate in different orbits, at least reporting wise. And we've been both quarantined or self-isolating here for the last 3 months. So it is a very big change, and it's been nice to be home. It's been nice to spend time with her, of course, but it is a big difference. And I think for people who live for these years, for these presidential years, where this is kind of the biggest reporting year for any political reporter, I think it is missed. And I think also our coverage is lacking to a degree because you are missing the texture of on-the-ground reporting, what people are thinking, how they're consuming the campaign. People can say, a campaign is doing this or a campaign is doing that, and here's what some high-placed operatives say. But I think you miss how, Bob and Jane in Wisconsin are consuming the Biden campaign, what they think of the Biden campaign, how some folks in North Carolina are consuming the Trump campaign, and what Trump is doing on a daily basis in the White House because he's gotten so much attention recently. So I do miss it. I miss the coverage of it and the stories that I got to work on in the last election and even in the midterms. But there are some upsides as well.
Yeah, I feel the same way about teaching. I'm hoping that we're going to be back in person in the fall. I'm teaching my campaigns and elections class that I've been teaching since year 2000. And I see some of my former students online here as attendees, and they can they'll probably agree. There's something about us following the campaign together in person, and then talking about it afterwards. And
I mean, for you as somebody who teaches elections and politics, this is also a huge year where I think your course and your curriculum is even richer because there's something actually going on in real life.
Oh, absolutely.
That you can relate to.
Absolutely. As a researcher, the same way. We're seeing innovations by the candidates, and this is something that a lot of campaigns have been wanting to do anyway, to move into incorporate digital more into their campaigns, and now they're being forced to do so. So for researchers, this is great.
Yeah, that is a good topic, and it's hard. I mean, you've seen. I think this is something you can probably talk to. The Trump campaign has done a very good job of integrating digital into their campaign. And I think it's the one thing that Democrats are willing to acknowledge Trump and his team have done a very good job at, is making a digital first campaign. And you've seen over the last few weeks, the Biden campaign has gotten a lot of criticism and has struggled to keep up with that. I think that's going to be, they didn't anticipate the campaign being entirely digital, but now that it is, they're having to play a little bit of catch up. So do we want to go to some of the questions submitted? Should we do that?
All right, guys, so we've already got some questions submitted, and some of the questions that were pre-submitted were, you mentioned already the impossibility of virtual elections, but people are nervous about mail-in voting and whether or not what happened in Wisconsin will set a precedent for in-person voting during a pandemic. Can you speak to a little bit about your thoughts on mail-in voting?
I can start. So 5 states already have mail-in voting and vote by mail, and it tends to work pretty well. Other states have absentee voting, or what we call no excuse absentee voting, which is pretty much the same. So every state has some form of this already. And so the question is about trying to expand this at a much larger level. And I think that is sort of the unknown. All states, as I said, have absentee voting, but at this large scale, our election administration is not funded very well across the states. There's a lot of variation across the states. And so it's unclear how the different states will be able to handle such a large influx of mail-in ballots. The Trump campaign, I think, is focusing on the wrong thing. I mean, well, they have a reason for doing that, but it's not really about fraud. But it is a legitimate. There is a legitimate debate about how well this will work. States that are not prepared for such a large influx of ballots, how they're going to handle that, and we may not have results on election day if this election happens to be close. So that, and I think the other part of the question was about Wisconsin. Again, it's hard to say if this is setting a precedent, because again, our election administration is so decentralized, so it could vary from state to state, and some state courts may mandate vote by mail or allow the governor more flexibility to be able to implement that. Other states may follow Wisconsin's, may do something similar to Wisconsin.
Yeah, Jeff nailed it. I mean, the money issue is probably the biggest issue right now. I think Democrats asked for some $4 billion in one of these stimulus plans during the coronavirus to fund and to kind of protect election security amid a pandemic. And they got something like 400 million. So a significantly less number. And there are concerns that that's not going to be enough. The other issue is that you look at these states that do have all mail-in voting, the first being Oregon. It took them years to really get up to the ability to do all mail-in voting. So it's hard to see where certain states in the general election are able to do that in a timely manner when there's only 6 months until the general election. Mail-in voting is very popular. Polls show that people want access to mail-in voting, but what you're seeing is Democrats want access to all kinds of voting. They want to expand general access to voting. So they want to have in-person voting on election day, because there are some voting blocks, groups that polling shows like that and use that more often, and then they want to have the ability to also mail in vote. The funny thing to me, and I think I actually did a story on this, is the Oregon system was actually proposed in part by Republicans in the state who thought it would help them expand their reach to rural Oregon and boost those numbers. And so they were very much for it initially, and Democrats in Oregon were somewhat against it. And now that's obviously the politics of that have flipped in recent years.
Yeah, and the research on, I'm sure some people have the follow-up question is, what impact does it have as far as the result? Does one party tend to benefit more from mail-in voting? What the research shows is that vote by mail as well as absentee voting. Remember, most states don't have vote by mail, but all states have absentee voting. And those that have more flexible forms of absentee voting do have higher rates of turnout. So it does increase turnout. But what's interesting is it increases turnout across the board. There's not one particular demographic group that tends to turn out at a higher rate because of mail-in voting or no excuse absentee ballot voting. So the impact is pretty much uniform across groups. And for that reason, we have not seen any particular party do better as a rule. However, that doesn't mean that a particular party couldn't do better. It depends on how well organized that group is. And again, that varies from state to state. So Florida Republicans, for example, are very well organized. They have a very strong absentee ballot campaign. They used to have that in California. It doesn't really matter in California, elections aren't close. And in the past, it was actually Republicans that more so focused on absentee voting. So as far as the impact, yes, it makes a difference in increasing turnout, but as of right now, I don't see one party benefiting. Having said that, Democrats are convinced that it's going to help them. As Dan mentioned, across the board, their support, any form of making voting easier. Republicans are convinced that hurts them. And in today's coalitions, the way the two where they draw from, it's pretty much a wash.
Yeah, you're right about the education aspect. I mean, you have all these organizers who are old hands at door knocking and walking the streets of their cities and trying to get people to turn out, and now they're having to do that virtually. And so, and they're also having to really push mail-in voting, because the concern is what if the coronavirus returns in early November, or there's concerns around that? What are the election systems going to be able to do? And Jeff, you're completely right about, I think there's a high likelihood, and a lot of experts do, that it's, if this election is very close, it's hard to envision a result being, there being a result on election or general election day night.
And in a state like Massachusetts, could we see the state government removing that stipulation for absentee ballots to have an excuse? Can we see that going away as a possibility?
We may not see it legislatively, but it's also how it's enforced. And in Massachusetts, it's not really enforced. In Texas, they're saying they are going to enforce it, and that if you lie, first of all, being scared to vote because of the pandemic is not a valid excuse, and if you lie, you could be prosecuted. Now, whether they're actually going to direct resources to checking to see if people were really in town during that day, I doubt it. But I don't know if the Massachusetts legislature will act, but there could be some directive from the Secretary of State's office and he may already have that flexibility to expand the valid reasons for that.
Yeah. I'll let the Massachusetts expert answer that question.
Well, I'm not a Massachusetts expert, but that's what I've been hearing.
Got it.
We have a couple questions about polling. Can you speak to where our candidates are stacking up in the current polls, and maybe which polls should be looked at more frequently than others?
I could start with that. So there are a lot of good polls out there, and one thing that I would suggest people look at is a site called 538.com, which tends to aggregate a lot of polls. RealClearPolitics.com also aggregates polls. So what they're doing is averaging polls because some polls are better than others. What 538 does is they tend to, they give a weight to polls that are better, have a better track record, and actually, give a grade to them. And so I would urge you to take a look at that. How are they doing in the polls right now? I would really focus on the approval rating of President Trump, and we're seeing that in the low to mid 40s. It's sort of averaged 43 across the entire.
It's been incredibly consistent too.
It really has, and so it doesn't really matter the events. And just to make things very simple, no president has ever won re-election with an approval rating below 50%. And everyone above 50% has won re-election. So the closest we've seen here is Gerald Ford at 48%, and he won 48% of the vote. So to kind of make a long story short, things don't look good for President Trump. Not only approval rating, but if you look at national polls and then state-by-state polls, Democrats, though, are scared because they remember what happened last time.
Yeah.
And I think political scientists are scared because we don't want to make the same mistakes that we did. But the polling is a lot better this time around. They know what they did wrong, and they missed a lot of people that were Trump supporters. And so the polling is a lot better nationally as well as state by state. So I think, I definitely think that Biden is in a good position. The Democrats are in a good position. But I think it's good, if you're advising a Democrat, it's good to be scared. And I think that's part of why Hillary Clinton lost last time, is that they just could not expect that she could lose to Donald Trump. And it creates this complacency.
It's all about turnout too. I mean, these polls are based on what the turnout model is and how many people the pollsters expect to come out on election day. And the only caution that I would offer, Jeff, I think is completely right. The only caution I would offer is that they're a snapshot in time. Just because polling right now has Joe Biden up by X in Wisconsin or wherever, it's just a snapshot. It doesn't mean that's going to be the case in November. It doesn't mean that's going to be the case in June, in the next 2 weeks. We just don't know. And so, and it also, I think a lot of Democrats, because of 2016, looking at polls, see the polls, see Joe Biden is up, see that Donald Trump has been in the low to mid 40s approval rating for a long time, and their attitude is somewhat like, okay, but okay, but we have to turn out X, Y, and Z in Wisconsin. Okay, but we have to make sure we don't forget about reach states like Arizona and Georgia. So I think the question about where the polls stack up, Biden is certainly in a lead right now in most polls, but I don't think that means that that Democrats are complacent or feel like this is a foregone conclusion. There's so much time left. Hillary Clinton had massive leads over Trump in 2016 in some polls at different times. And I also think the Ford example, I'm glad you brought that up. The fact that Trump has been steady at 43, 44%, politics has changed a lot since Gerald Ford's time. And kind of the polarization and the fact that there's not that big of a middle. I think that is going to, that Trump at 44% isn't the same as Gerald Ford at 44%. So just those are things that I would consider.
Yeah, let me follow up on because there was a question that came up earlier on the pre-questions about a third-party candidate and whether that's one is going to be viable this time around. I don't think so. It doesn't look like it. And let's go back to 2016, where third-party candidates got a combined vote of about 6%. And part of the reason for that, and I think that hurt Hillary Clinton quite a bit, is that you had a number of people who were Republicans who didn't like Donald Trump, but they didn't like Hillary Clinton and did not want to vote for a Democrat. And having a libertarian candidate, a former Republican, gave them a place to go. This time around, I think some of those are willing to vote for Joe Biden. He doesn't pose a threat to them the way that Hillary Clinton did. And I think on the progressive side, you had some Democrats, some progressives that thought that voting for the Green Party candidate was a free vote. Hillary Clinton was going to win. They didn't like Hillary Clinton, and here was a way to register a protest. And it didn't work out the way they planned in Wisconsin and Michigan. And I don't think that's going to happen again. The two candidates have been nominated. I don't know if the Greens have actually nominated their candidate yet, but neither of them have a national, the Libertarians, the Greens have a national figure at the top of the ticket. And I think Democrats are willing to live with Joe Biden, and a few never-Trumpers can deal with him too.
Yeah, and you saw someone like a Justin Amash who was considering running a third-party candidate, a congressman from Michigan, or former Republican congressman from Michigan who bowed out and decided not to. So there were some Democrats who were concerned about that being an issue, especially in Michigan, which is going to be an important state for Biden. But he bowed out, decided not to run a third party. I agree with everything you said. I don't think there's going to be not to the level that there was in 2016, especially.
You have a question, Dan, from Paul Stanish online. Great to see you, he says.
Hi, Paul.
His question is, were you surprised that Biden was able to consolidate the Democratic candidates so quickly after South Carolina? It seemed extremely quick, given that Super Tuesday states had not yet cast ballots.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was. As someone who was covering Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, I was definitely surprised. The 3 days between South Carolina and Super Tuesday were probably the most exhausting of this year for me. If I want to get this correct, but I was in South Carolina for Super Tuesday. I was flying to Dallas for an event that Pete Buttigieg was going to do. And I landed, I got to the Hertz area and picked up my car. And as I was driving out of the Hertz garage, I was told that there's a chance he could be dropping out. A source told me that there was a chance he could be dropping out. So I literally turn around in the garage. I probably had my Hertz car for like 3 or 4 minutes tops, and then filed on him. He dropped out that night, and then filed on that from Dallas. I then flew to Oklahoma, to Tulsa, that I was going to cover a Amy Klobuchar event. And the next morning, I'm in Oklahoma waiting for her to get there, and she decides she's going to drop out, or reports start coming out that she's going to drop out. And then I get on a flight back to Dallas that night for their big joint event where Buttigieg did an event with Joe Biden, and then Amy Klobuchar and Beto O'Rourke did an event with Joe Biden. Yeah, I was surprised. I mean, I think all the indications after Iowa and New Hampshire were that Joe Biden was in a tenuous position. There was always a knowledge that he was going to be a very strong candidate in South Carolina. It was his firewall for the longest time. And he has a great relationship with Black voters, especially there. So I wasn't surprised he did so well in South Carolina. I think it dawned on people that when he was so commanding in South Carolina, and when the polls began to show how bad people like Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg were going to do in some of those Super Tuesday states. I mean, Pete Buttigieg he had a strategy, but it was really a kind of a one-off, picking up a few delegates here and there strategy, that the writing was somewhat on the wall in between those two contests, that he wasn't going to have the staying power that he had thought he was going to have. So yes, I was surprised by the fact that they consolidated so quickly, especially the fact they dropped out so quickly. I think that both Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg are somewhat pragmatic candidates. I think they know they both have a future in either a Biden administration or a future, presidential run down the line, especially Pete Buttigieg being so young. I think the figure was that he could wait 40 years and run again as the same age that Joe Biden was, or something like that. Oh, I hope that's right, but it's around that. I think they knew they have a future, and that it might not be the best thing for them to kind of drag this out when there's no chance that they can win.
Yeah, one of our participants, Tracy, makes a good point about. I think they saw the writing on the wall, and they can do the math, and that there were quite a few what we call the moderate lane, and so there were 3 or 4. And remember, it was still you forgot about Michael Bloomberg. He was there too, and he was going on a Super Tuesday, and so you had about 4 or 5 candidates in the so-called moderate lane. But the key thing also was their lack of support among African Americans. And so it was Biden, and then to some extent Sanders and Bloomberg, who were a second choice for African Americans. In the Democratic Party, you're not going to be the nominee unless you have significant support from African Americans. And Buttigieg and Klobuchar were really close to to 1 or 2%.
It was the issue that hampered Buttigieg since the outset. I mean, he had his rise after the CNN town hall and the historic nature of his candidacy, but quite quickly it became clear that there were issues he had with the Black community in South Bend, and then those kind of became issues across the country, and especially in South Carolina, where I think 60% of the electorate was African American. I actually went from Dallas to Florida that next day to cover Bloomberg's event on Super Tuesday in West Palm Beach, a few miles actually from the president's Mar-a-Lago estate. And it was a very weird scene because it was a very well-funded event with smoke machines and free food and free booze. And it was a very interesting event to go from a small events like with Pete Buttigieg and these kind of more, not shoestring, but certainly not Bloomberg level funded events. And then you get to West Palm Beach with Mike Bloomberg, and it's, everyone's getting free T-shirts and signs and booze and food and smoke machines. And yeah, that was the last political event I covered. So that's, going off on a unique note.
That was certainly interesting, and I could hear about those questions and that experience at another time. Some questions about fact checking. Does this play, this is very topical today. Does fact checking look to play a bigger role this time around? And what impacts does the Cambridge Analytica case have on social media campaigns this time around?
Certainly, it's put a lot of pressure on these social media companies to, the fact checking aspect of it. Obviously, Trump is signing this executive order today in large part because Twitter began putting up a little marker underneath some of his tweets about mail-in voting. I think it does put a lot of pressure on Facebook and Twitter, and I think it remains to be seen whether they will respond to the level that I think a lot of people would like them. I know that CNN has really invested in our fact-checking operation. We have some really good, top-notch fact-checkers who do a lot of great work on the site. We hired a guy named Daniel Dale, who was kind of a preeminent fact-checker in 2016 and especially into the 2017, 2018 range. And he's been working with us, fact-checking the president and the candidates. So I know that it's important to us. I think that it remains to be seen whether the social media companies are going to, respond in kind.
Jeff, any thoughts on the role of social media?
Yeah, it's important for all the campaigns in acquiring data and to be able to micro-target better and to really micro-target those messages. But I would just say about the outside fact checkers, that the ones that are checking the candidates and what they're doing. I think this is something that plays into the hands of the Trump campaign and President Trump. And it doesn't really matter if what he says is true or not, or if it's shown that what he said was not true. He wants to be in the news, and he makes a number of outrageous claims for a reason, and it's to get us to not talk about something else. And then we spend 3 days talking about this conspiracy theory that he is pushing, and not talking about, let's say, the response to the pandemic. And most of his supporters are not going to believe the fact checkers anyway, and those who don't like him already saw what he said was suspect. So I'm not really quite sure how this really helps sort of the public interest. I think it actually benefits the Trump campaign to be talking about these issues.
Great. Another question from someone who knows you, Dan, Joseph McKenna. He says, given the prevalence of technology in post-COVID campaigning, do you see a younger vote base becoming more impactful? And will older voters feel disenfranchised?
Hello, Joe. I would love to know his thoughts on this as well. I think that we've seen young voters while they're engaged in politics, they have a lower level of voting. They don't vote in high numbers, and older voters, it's just ingrained in them that they vote in higher numbers. So I actually think that this election is going to be similar to past elections where older voters are more likely to vote than young voters. I don't think COVID plays a big role in that, especially if you have mail-in voting or absentee voting, where older voters are more likely to know how to do that, or that they've done that in the past, especially. I also think it's important to remember that a lot of older voters are used to voting in person, used to walking the few blocks to their local school, and maybe they are willing to do that, during a pandemic. To me, it really depends on what the status of the pandemic is in late October, early November, how people are feeling about things. So I don't know. I don't have any data to back up that thought, but I think it's pretty clear that young voters are less likely to vote than older voters based on past elections. But I do wonder what the Trump campaign and Biden campaign are going to try and do around this election to switch that. I mean, you've seen past campaigns be very successful in engaging young voters. Obviously, the Obama campaign in 2008 is a good example. But I don't know if Biden and Trump campaign or race is going to be able to do that like the Obama campaign in 2008. What do you think, Jeff?
I think if any campaign is banking on young voters to carry them victory, they're in trouble. That's a good sign. I think if you go back to the 2008 campaign, candidate Obama did very well among young voters, but he also did very well among other voters as well. He increased the Democratic share of the vote among all age groups, and yes, among younger voters a lot more. Having said that, I think, it does, regardless of what happens, what the turnout is, it really is a benefit to Democrats. And if you want to compare the electorate today from 2016, when you bring in the newer voters, they are very heavily for the Democrats. But I think more troubling for the Trump campaign is how he's slipping among older voters. Mm-hmm. And the two candidates are running even. I wouldn't pay a lot of attention to the individual polls that come out because they'll really fluctuate a lot. But what they're based on a very small sample, so maybe a national sample of all voters, and then they take 150 out of that are senior citizens, and so you're gonna, there's a high margin of error to that. But still, it's pretty. I think the Trump campaign should be quite concerned. The one group that they really held on to in the 2018 elections was the older voters. And
I just looked up the exit polls from 2016, and he won 52% of voters older than 45. And the 65 and older, he won 52%, and the same number of 45 to 64. So if he slips in that department, it's a very troubling sign for the Trump campaign.
And then for the younger voters, the Democrats won 67% of 18 to 25-year-olds in the 2018 election. That's the same that Obama won. But here's what's even more troubling for why Republicans should be worried is that turnout among young voters in midterm elections is very low. And it's not going to be, it'll go back up. It was 13% in 2018. In a presidential year, they will comprise about 18% of the electorate. And if that number holds, it's bad news for the Republicans, not just at the presidential level, but in many of these key Senate races that they need to hold on to keep their majority.
I do wonder, and this is just, I don't have an answer to this. I do wonder what the fact that both candidates being over 70 years old, how that plays with younger voters. Are they going to be, obviously Obama invigorated younger voters because he was younger, because he was fresh and new and different. How does a late 70s Biden and I think an early 70s Trump, how does that impact the engagement with younger voters? I think about my sisters who are younger. I think about their friends. I just don't know if they're going to be, get excited about that kind of election.
I don't think they'll get excited about the candidates. But there is something about, this election is exciting. And we remember, I think there is really no correlation between age of the voter and age of the candidate. Bernie Sanders' base was young voters, and he's the same age as Biden, but the biggest split was age in the Democratic.
And Pete Buttigieg, his biggest base of the Democratic Party was older voters. You would go to his events, You go to his events, and this young 30-something-year-old candidate would get up on stage, and he would look out and see nothing but gray. So it was remarkable.
It really is about issues and about
Yeah.
perspective, and that's what really, I think, moves young voters. But also about young voters, it's about change. And in a period where there's a lot of uncertainty and things aren't really that great as they're coming of age, there's a need for change, and that helps a candidate like Barack Obama in 2008 when there's a recession. It helped a candidate like Donald Trump in 2016. So young voters, independent voters, those who are always wanting change, it helps that party that's out of power.
And you've seen both of the candidates, Trump and Biden, already try and grab onto that change mantle. I mean, Trump's argument is that I've made this change over the last 4 years. Let's keep it going. I'm the ultimate change maker. I'm so different than all our past presidents. I'm going to shake everything up. And then Biden is saying we changed too much, and the biggest change we can make is going back to normal. I talked to a Biden advisor for a story last week, and he said exactly that Biden is the change candidate because the change we made in 2016 was so great that he believes the biggest change can be going back to some level of normalcy. So we'll see.
And so how will Biden's VP choice impact things as they stand now? We have some folks asking to hear more your thoughts on his choices.
Go ahead, Jeff. You go first.
So in general, I know you all don't want to hear this, but in general, VP candidates don't really matter that much. We spend a lot of time on it because that's all we have to talk about from the time that we know who the nominee is going to be and the convention.
The news hole.
Yeah, it is, and it's fun to talk about that. What the research shows is it has a small impact in the state from where that candidate is from. But having said that, I think it does say something about that particular presidential candidate and how they're going to govern. And so there are a couple of ways to go about it. One is that you can double down on sort of the stick that you're pushing. So you think about Clinton and Gore, a Southern moderate from a border state moderate to picking another one just like you. And other times you're trying to bring in someone from the other wing of the party to try to balance the ticket, or it could be a regional balance. Right now the debate is, should he try to nominate an African-American candidate to energize the African-American vote, or someone more progressive, whether it be African-American or not, like Elizabeth Warren, because of the trouble that he had with some younger voters and the Sanders voters. So it may not be about a particular state that he wants. And let's say there is no perfect candidate. Yes, he would love to get a progressive candidate who has appeal to African Americans but doesn't scare off moderates from Wisconsin. They don't.
That's the candidate that they make in a lab.
That's right. So Kamala Harris seems to be, to me, the safest choice. And being African American, being female, being somewhat moderate. I think depending on whether you're a moderate or progressive, you can read into either way.
Yeah.
Her being an attorney general and a tough prosecutor, I think kind of makes her a little bit more appealing to the center, or at least doesn't scare them off. But the big buzz right now is for Elizabeth Warren, and there are some pollsters that are pushing her, showing that she brings the most to the ticket. Again, if you are depending on your VP candidate to help you to win, that says something about you. So I wouldn't. What you really want to do is find somebody that's not going to hurt you. And I think that's the real key for the Biden campaign right now.
And he has said he more than arguably anybody in this country knows the most about being vice president. Kind of a unique position in which the person who's picking the vice president has held that job in the past and knows it very well. He also was very proud of the relationship he had with Barack Obama, and he calls it simpatico. This idea that they both got along personally, they liked each other by the end of their 8 years. They're still close, and that they were somewhat in line politically. That there may have been some differences, but that he very much was deferential to the president, to his views, to what he wanted to do. And so I think if you're looking at who Joe Biden is going to pick, just look at the words that he has said. He has run a very unique VP search because he's been very public about the whole thing. You know, he's having tryouts with people who come on his digital shows and his digital fundraisers, and he's talking openly about that he's considering this person, that he has said he's whittled them down already. He's only going to pick a woman. So I think he's been very public about it, and you kind of know what he is looking for. I think he is looking for the version that he provided to Obama. And what he did for Obama was he offered him a level of foreign policy experience, which is something Obama didn't have at the time. There was a sense that he wasn't an expert in foreign policy, and Biden had so many years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then he offered him an entree into more working class voters. You know, the boy from Scranton that Joe Biden is so proudly, that was the view that Obama got from Biden. So, you know, there are lots of people who have opinions on, you know, you should pick somebody who wins you a state. So that would be like an Amy Klobuchar argument, helps you win Minnesota, which is an important state, or Gretchen Whitmer, who's the governor of Michigan, helps you win Michigan. There are those who argue you should pick somebody who reaches out to a voting bloc, like African-American voters. Kamala Harris is a good example of that. The one note I will make is that Joe Biden does a pretty good job himself of reaching out to African-American voters. He, more so than even Kamala Harris during the primary, did a very, you know, was very talented and got a bigger share of the black vote. And then you have the people who say, you know, bridge the party, bring the party together, pick Elizabeth Warren. And then obviously that comes with certain pluses. I mean, she would invigorate progressives, but you don't need help winning Massachusetts. And then you also have they are a bit at odds politically. There are things that they don't agree on. We did a story last week actually about Elizabeth Warren's chances with a colleague of mine and I, and how they are rising recently. And actually COVID plays into that. You know, at this time where there's huge economic issues that are not only looming, but are happening right now, the economy is going to be a big issue in the November campaign. And so you see someone like Elizabeth Warren, who is an economic focused candidate, has those big ideas, is seen by many Democrats as prepared with plans to step in. You know, she is somebody who you could see him picking if the frame is go big, respond to this economic crisis. And then the last thing I'll say is he is an older candidate. So you want to pick somebody, or he has said he wants to be a bridge. He's referred to himself as that he's a bridge to this next generation of Democrats. And he said that about everyone from a Kamala Harris to a Pete Buttigieg. Now, obviously Pete Buttigieg is not going to be the VP because of Biden's already whittled that down, but that says a lot about also the administration he would build as well, I think.
Yeah, I just a follow-up point. Because of his age, I think maybe this time the VP choice may matter a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I think the number one criteria is going to be, is this person ready to be president? And I think that's
totally right.
That's what hurt John McCain in 2008. Not that he would have won, but I think, you know, the reason for selecting Sarah Palin is he had to roll the dice. But you know, you look at 2000 when George W. Bush picked Dick Cheney. He did not need Wyoming to win, but to have somebody who was ready to be president with that foreign policy experience. So I think that hurts someone like Stacey Abrams, who has not held statewide office before. I think to some extent it hurts Gretchen Whitmer because she's only been governor for 2 years. And she's really busy right now with the crisis in her own state.
I mean, that's the other aspect. Our governors hurt because it's difficult to ask a governor who's having to manage their state during the COVID crisis. Is it impossible to ask them to come and run as vice president?
Right. And so I think that for a senator, someone who's been in Washington a long time, a governor would have been probably the best choice. But the top choices really are senators. And another factor to throw in there, and why you might eliminate certain senators, female senators, is that do they come from a swing state, which is good for helping you win the presidential election, but then that would open up a special election in that state. And the Democrats are really worried about not winning the majority. Or falling further behind. So in Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota, it's a swing state. I think the Democrats would keep that. They'd obviously keep California, which is why Kamala Harris is a good choice. But Tammy Baldwin is high on the list in Wisconsin, but opening up a special election there could be very difficult. Those are all factors that are being thrown in into the mix here. Can I just, there was one question when we were talking about African-American vote and VP candidates. Somebody brought up a question about Biden's remark on a talk show, a bad joke that he made, how that might affect his standing with minority candidates. And I'd say none at all. And so I would also say about either of the candidates, don't focus on one particular thing. We have record unemployment rate and 5% negative GDP growth, and it doesn't affect Donald Trump's approval rating one bit. And so the votes are pretty much fixed right now. But as Dan said earlier, Joe Biden has a very good relationship with the African-American community. So he gets sort of a pass on bad jokes. And I've kind of been following this guy for a long time from his first campaign. He makes a lot of bad jokes. It's not going to be the last one. So stay tuned for more.
And he apologized very quickly, which I think helped him. He just said I was cavalier. And I think actually that stems from the fact that he's so comfortable with Black voters. He thought he could be kind of jokey and smiling and be cavalier about it. I tell this to a lot of friends who reach out to me about these issues that kind of blow up and dwindle. There's going to be a million of these between now and November where it seems like, I remember the 2016 campaign where there were multiple moments where you thought, oh my gosh, this is over. Like, this is it. This is the end of the election. And it wasn't. So I agree with you that you got to be wary of making these kind of grand sweeping predictions before November.
We have some questions about how the economy, you already mentioned the economy. How will that continue to impact over these next 6 months, the election, if it improves and if it doesn't improve?
So let me follow up to some, Dan sort of said earlier that, the electorate today or elections today are very different than they were in the 1970s. And the political polarization is much greater today. And so the state of the economy does not matter as much. And that's why I said focus on approval ratings. Well, so why did Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan win landslide reelections? And it's because you had people of the other party that were willing to switch over. Times were good. They're willing to vote for an incumbent, even if he wasn't of the same party. Mm-hmm. Independents are really judging candidates or incumbents based on their performance. That's never going to happen. I mean, you had George W. Bush and Barack Obama winning re-election with 51% of the vote in the last two elections. And so Republicans, it doesn't really matter what the state of the economy is. They're going to stay there with their candidate. Democrats are going to be against the president. And what we've seen in these last few elections, in the last 20 years, is that independents are not really focusing on performance as much as they want change. Every 4 years, they are voting against by a slight margin, the party in power. We'll see if, with GDP being -5 and unemployment 15%, maybe that will hurt the president more so. But I think there's a pretty high floor for the president that he won't go below just because of the solid support that he has.
I definitely think that's true. I do think the Trump campaign is concerned about the economic news. I mean, he was planning fully to run on the economy that he had helped build over the last 3 years. And now that it's taken a dive like this, you've seen a few things from him. Rhetorically, he says, and his campaign will say, I helped build this economy over the last 3 years. I can do it again. That's kind of been the refrain that, like, it won't take me long to get us back to where we were. And to some degree, the stock market is back to, where it was, or at least in the ballpark. That obviously is not what's happening on Main Street and in companies and with the unemployment number. The second thing I think is that you see Trump talking about Q4 numbers, about how it's really bad now, it's going to be bad in Q2, and Q3 is not going to be great. But he's going to talk a lot about what it's going to be like in Q4, because that'll be after the election. If he can promise and promise and promise that Q4 is going to be great, I think that's the way he'll talk about the economy, especially if the economic news continues to be bad. But Democrats are, whether it impacts independents or not, they are planning on kind of using what was going to be a strong suit for Trump against him in November.
It actually, it definitely makes it better for Democrats, and you'd rather run this particular way. But
yeah,
when I'm hearing Dan talking about the way the Trump campaign is trying to message this, I'm thinking back to the 1992 campaign, the 1980 campaign, Jimmy Carter and George Bush, and what the models, forecasting models tend to show is that it's second quarter GDP numbers that in the election year that tend to really impact the election, because that's when voters are really focusing and they're feeling the impact. And if the quarter four is great, but that's after the election, and most people don't believe it's you need another a quarter or two before. What we saw in 1992, the economy was actually doing well at the end of 1992, but it wasn't in the first two quarters, and that's what's really sticks in people's minds.
There are so many good questions, and we're coming up against the hour. I will kind of turn it over to you two. Are there any questions in the question box you'd like to answer before our time is up?
We just want to like rapid fire.
Oh, yeah. Electoral college. We didn't say anything about electoral college. I know there were so many.
Okay, so I will. What was the question about the electoral college?
One came up. What is the purpose of the electoral college, and do you ever see it going away? And
no.
I think we need a little bit more time to talk about the purpose. Do you ever see it going away? No. What we may have a conversation about it if Republicans get to be disadvantaged by it, and then all of a sudden they may decide to be against it. But right now, the key is that why would smaller states give up the higher weight that they have? And it would be very difficult to do that. So there's no point in really talking about electoral college reform, because it's not gonna happen. But it is something we do need to pay attention to this election, because we may have the same scenario as before, where we have just a few states that are very close. So Clinton won the states that she won by a large margin. The states that Donald Trump won, some of the swing states, he won those by very small margins, and the reason he was able to win the Electoral College. We could go on and on about scenarios if there's a tie in the House of Representatives. And I don't know if that will bore some people or not, but the short answer is not going away. We're stuck with it for a while.
I'll let the professor handle that answer. There's one about, should we take Katie Hill's seat? It was a suburban Los Angeles seat that Democrats had controlled and then lost in a special election, as a good representation of pandemic campaigning and what's going to happen. I mean, to a degree, yes, it can be looked at as a bellwether about how campaigns had to deal with the coronavirus. I think it was sprung on them last minute, so I don't think they were able to plan as much as they would have. There will be in November, and I don't think you can overread what happens in a special election in one congressional district in California to say what's going to happen across the country. I mean, it's a data point, but it's not the entire. It's not something that will tell us what's going to happen across the entire country.
Right. I mean, just the Republicans nominated a very good candidate, and the Democrat retiring did because of a scandal. So it really helped them. Whether that's we don't see that though across the board, and actually most of the House map looks really good for Democrats, just because of who's retiring and where they're retiring. And those are areas that Democrats did well in 2016. But that does matter when we get back to the Electoral College. If for some reason we did have a tie, or we didn't know candidate had was able to get a majority, and it would go to the House of Representatives. And it's not who controls the House, but how many state delegations, because you vote by state.
Yeah.
And right now, even if for some reason it was to happen today, which it wouldn't, the Republicans actually control more state delegations than the Democrats. They have about 26 or so, 27. So it's really important for Democrats not just to maintain their majority, but they need to win in states like North Carolina and Michigan and maybe Wisconsin. There are not many places for them to actually where they'll be winning are in states that they already hold a majority.
Yeah.
But that may be something that we see. I doubt it, but you never know.
You're ahead. Yeah, we're a bit ahead. One other question about how likely is it that the current administration will try to delay or even cancel the November election? It's not likely. It's certainly the answer that I would give. I mean, it's different than primaries, which are run by state election boards, or even caucuses, which are run by the parties in those states. It's different. This is run by federal statute, and so there was a Supreme Court case, I think, in the 1800s that actually found that even martial law, even something like that Trump could actually do, not martial law. The term is even martial law does not suspend the Constitution. So even if something happened around the pandemic, that it's not going to delay the election, because the Constitution mandates that is and federal law mandates that is the election day. So Congress would have to actually do something, and that's highly, highly, highly unlikely.
Right, and so the Electoral College still has to meet in December in their state capitals, and for some reason that didn't happen. Trump's term expired January 20th, and as does Vice President Pence's term. And guess who's next in line to be president? It would be the Speaker of the House. And so
that is all you need to know about how unlikely it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This has been such a pleasure. It sounds like we'll need to do this again to answer more questions at some point. But I really appreciate you giving the time. For those of you who are still there with us, we'll be sending out a recording of the session and a follow-up email tomorrow. Again, thank you both, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, guys. See ya.
Bye.